In accordance with Standing Order 43, the time for member statements has concluded. Questions without notice. The member for Sydney.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. In 2013, the former Labor government agreed a detailed plan with the states to improve school performance in reading, maths and science. Later that same year, this government junked it, calling the plan red tape. In its 7th year of government, enough time for a student to start and finish high school, will the Prime Minister apologise to parents for turning his back on school improvement?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. I never take anything the member for Sydney presents at the dispatch box, Mr Speaker, with any accuracy, because she's been found out on so many occasions, Mr Speaker, to come to the dispatch box and make a series of smears and assertions which are not borne out, as is indeed on the case in what she's just presented to this House, Mr Speaker. What I can tell parents right across this country, Mr Speaker, that under our government we are providing record funding for schools, that under our government for the first time real needs-based funding is being provided, growing from $13.8 billion in 2014 to $17.5 billion in 2017, and that will grow to $32.4 billion in 2029. And, Mr Speaker, what we're doing is we are providing that funding for those schools around the country, Mr Speaker, without increasing taxes, Mr Speaker. We're not going to put our hands into the pockets.
The Prime Minister will resume his seat. The Leader of the Opposition on a point of order.
Yes, Mr Speaker. On relevance, the question went to school performance, the latest figures that show Australia falling behind the world.
The Leader of the Opposition.
That's what it goes to.
The Leader of the Opposition
Maths,
the Leader of the Opposition has
English,
made his point of
science.
order on relevance. He'll resume his seat. I'm just going to say I hear the point of order from the Leader of the Opposition. There are a number of aspects to it, but when questions have taglines, as indeed this did, and let me be very specific, asking whether the Prime Minister would apologise, what I'm hearing is a response to that from the Prime Minister. He can answer it in any way he wishes, provided he's on the policy topic that's there. So the Prime Minister is in order.
Mr Speaker, I was asked about funding of schools, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, accusations were made by the Labor Party as they made at the last election.
If the Prime Minister can pause, members on my left, just to be clear, and I'm going to be very clear on this, the question did not ask about funding. It asked about other aspects, but I said it was in order for the Prime Minister to go to the government's policy approach, given the tagline that was asked. The Prime Minister has the member for Lyons. Prime Minister.
The member for Sydney raised the proposals that were previously put forward by the Labor Party. The member for Sydney, at the last election and the previous elections, Mr Speaker, has maintained an untruth about the government's policies when it comes to education funding. Our education funding is at record levels. And the reason we can fund our schools at record levels, Mr Speaker, is we know how to manage money. The reason no one can believe anything the Labor Party say about schools funding, about hospitals funding, about funding for disabilities is because they know Labor cannot manage money. That means they cannot keep any promise they make when it comes to the commitments they make on schools and hospitals and disability services and aged care or any of this, because the Australian public know that the Labor Party cannot manage money. Now, that was true under the former Leader of the Opposition, and it's even more true under this Leader of the Opposition, Mr Speaker, who hasn't sat round, Mr Speaker, and put a budget together. Not once in all of his years in government did he sit on an ERC that led to a budget. Not once, Mr Speaker.
The member for Isaacs. The member for Isaacs. The Leader of the Opposition has already called a point of order on relevance. So
this is about misleading Parliament again.
The Leader of the Opposition will resume his seat. The Leader of the Opposition doesn't have the call, and the Leader of the Opposition well knows if he takes issue with something that's said that he believes is a misrepresentation, there is a very clear procedure for him to follow at the end of question time. The Prime Minister.
The outcomes of the PISA 2018 results today are deeply concerning to the government, Mr Speaker. They're deeply concerning to the government, and that is why we have put the funding in place to ensure
the Prime Minister's time has concluded. No, members on my left. The member for Curtin has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Will the Prime Minister advise the House how the stability and certainty of the Morrison government is strengthening Australia's resilience to deal with future threats and challenges? And is the Prime Minister aware of any alternative approaches?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I thank the member for Curtin for her question. Earlier today, together with the Deputy Prime Minister and the Foreign Minister, I had the great privilege to meet with Tim Weeks, who has come home to Australia after one of the most incredible ordeals that you could imagine an Australian to go through. And I had the opportunity to thank the President of the United States recently for the incredible role the United States played. I raise this, Mr Speaker, because Mr Weeks' story is one of the incredible resilience of an Australian. And, Mr Speaker, this is the nature of Australians. We are an incredibly resilient people, and our government is building our nation's resilience, Mr Speaker, by backing those Australians in, about their optimism in the future, not the pessimism of the Labor Party, but, Mr Speaker, the optimism, the irrepressible optimism of Australians is what our government is investing in. We're investing in their financial resilience. We're investing in the economic resilience of this country and the national security resilience of this country. Mr Speaker, today's national accounts show that through-the-year growth has risen from 1.4% to 1.7%. What it shows, Mr Speaker, is Australians over the past year have earned more. Household disposable income up 2.5%. That's the highest increase in 10 years, Mr Speaker, and average compensation was up 2.9% over the year, rising to the above 10-year average. We are now in a place where we can say that we have ensured since the last election, through these results, it demonstrates we said Australians would earn more and they could also keep more of what they earn. And through the tax relief that we have provided those Australians, they have chosen to invest in that in their own resilience. I can tell you, Mr Speaker, Mr Speaker, I've just heard, Mr Speaker, from the interjection of that member opposite. He says they haven't earned more. Well, Mr Speaker, the household disposable income went up by 2.5%. By 2.5%, Mr Speaker. It's the highest in a decade, and the average compensation for Australians went up by 2.9%, which went up over the 10-year average. Now, I know those opposite are illiterate with the economy and national finances, because that's what the Australian people also know, Mr Speaker. I trust Australians with their money, and Australians trust this government with their money too, Mr Speaker, and that's why they returned us. They returned us because they know this government knows how to manage money, and they know the Labor Party doesn't. Our investment in expanding our export markets, our investment in the essential services that Australians rely on are backed up in the public final demand figures that are in those national accounts. We have been taking the right decisions for the Australian economy. We're backing in, Mr Speaker, the irrepressible optimism of Australians, because we know that's where our future lies.
The member for Sydney.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Education. According to the 2018 PISA results released overnight, Australia has recorded our worst ever international test results in reading, maths and science. Earlier this week, the Minister said that government reforms will, and I quote, will lift student outcomes. Minister, when?
The Minister for Education has the call.
Thanks, Mr Speaker, and can I thank the Shadow Minister for her question, because it enables me to tell the House not only are we providing record funding for public schools, record funding for Catholic schools, but record funding for independent schools, but also we are now focusing on turning that record funding into better outcomes and better results. For too long, especially from those opposite, all we have heard about is funding, funding, funding and funding. Right? And this comes from a party who was in government, had 27 different funding arrangements in place. 27 different funding arrangements in place. We now have needs-based funding in place, and we are focusing on getting better results and better outcomes. And that is why next week's COAG meeting is so important.
The member for Kingsford Smith, the member for Solomon.
If the Leader of the Opposition would just listen for once, he might learn something. He might just learn something. Because next week's COAG, as I said yesterday, is going to be one of the most important COAG meetings of the year. Because what we need to see from state and territory governments is a commitment to reform, to turn around our outcomes and our results. What we need to hear from state and territory governments is a commitment to put students first, and to ensure that those basics, those fundamentals of literacy and numeracy are at the heart of everything that we teach. Because if we do that, we will turn these results and these outcomes around.
The member for Kingsford Smith is warned.
A proposal to state and territory education ministers. We want to ensure that there are progressions in place so that we can map for every student across the nation the progressions they are taking when it comes to literacy and numeracy. This was something that was never done on that side.
Has the minister concluded his answer? The member for Sydney on a point of order.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. On relevance, I said, when are the reforms going to work that he claims he's made? It's a very clear question. When?
The minister is being relevant. I'll just say to the member for Sydney, I shouldn't have to remind her of everything she asked in the question. I think the fact her point of order was much shorter than the question illustrates the point. The minister has the call.
Speaker. So next week's COAG is going to be incredibly important. Can I say to those opposite, rather than coming in here lecturing us about this or that, why don't you actually encourage the state and territory ministers to come to that meeting next week and be bold, be ambitious, put students at the heart of the agenda, put literacy and numeracy at the heart of the agenda. That is what we want to see. The results that we've seen overnight mean that we need to take action and take action now, and that is what the federal government wants to do next week.
The minister's time has concluded. Just before I call the member for Lyne, in case they didn't hear it over their own shouting, the members for Kingsford Smith and Sydney are warned. So too is the member for Solomon. And since the member for Cooper is looking at me, I remind her she was already warned at about 9:33 this morning. The member for Lyne.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Deputy Prime Minister and the Minister for Infrastructure, Transport and Regional Development. Will the Deputy Prime Minister please inform the House how the Morrison and McCormack government's stable and certain budget management is building resilience for rural and regional Australia, ensuring future opportunities are realised? Thanks.
Just before I call the Deputy Prime Minister, members on my left, the Deputy Prime Minister has the call.
By popular demand, it seems, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, I heard... Please listen. I heard one of the most inspiring stories ever in this place this morning when I met Timothy Weeks. Mr Speaker, what a courageous Australian. He has spent 3 years going from remote location to remote location in Afghanistan. Yet despite that, Mr Speaker, despite the fact that he has endured this terrible ordeal, he remained gracious to his captors after being freed. He is truly a remarkable Australian. We have much to thank for our officials, for our DFAT, for our defence officials for being able, US officials as well, for being able to free Timothy Weeks. And Timothy and I share something in common. We went to the same schools together, St Michael's Regional High School and Trinity Senior High School. He probably was far more studious than I. Mr Speaker, he is truly an inspiration, and he is an example of a resilient Australian. He is a fine example of a regional Australian, and I've already taken steps to make sure that when he has a homecoming in Wagga Wagga before year's end, it will be one to remember. Mr Speaker, the member for Lyne asked me about resilience. He asked me about the resilience of his communities, and yes, they are hurting. 250,000 hectares have been burnt out in the electorate of Lyne. There are still fires burning between Taree and Foster, and we absolutely have a debt of gratitude to our first responders, to our volunteer, to our full-time firefighters, Mr Speaker, to our SES people, Mr Speaker. And we're certainly building resilience in our communities, Mr Speaker, in regional Australia by backing our farmers. I can hear the member for Hunter yelling out. I mean, he's just a recidivist, Mr Speaker. When I'm talking about building resilience in regional communities, Mr Speaker, and I'm talking about fires and I'm talking about our farmers, you could just be quiet just for a change. But, Mr Speaker, when I talk about our farmers, I talk about our free trade agreements that have...
The member for Isaacs. The Deputy Prime Minister has the
shouldn't be speaking again this week. He wouldn't know a farmer if he met one, quite frankly. Quite frankly, what a disgrace you are. Wouldn't know a constituent, doesn't even live in his own electorate. Mr Speaker, when I talk about
members
farmers,
on
I
both
talk about the
sides.
3 free trade agreements that we've been able to
The member for
sign.
Moreton is warned.
That we've been able to sign, that we've been able to ratify, that we've been able to pass through the Senate with Peru, with Hong Kong, with Indonesia, with those countries, Mr Speaker. We're building the Inland Rail, $9.3 billion, and we're certainly investing $100 million into taxiways and runways for regional airports. That's building a better future.
Has concluded just before I call the member for Griffith. The Deputy Prime Minister. I'll just let members settle for a second. Before I call the member for Griffith, I inform the House we have present in the gallery this afternoon Mr Tim Weeks, who's been mentioned by both the Prime Minister and the Deputy Prime Minister. And as you all know, Tim has recently returned to Australia after being held captive in Afghanistan for over 3 years. Tim, the whole country is glad you are home, and we're glad you're here with us today. The Leader of the Opposition on a brief indulgence.
Yes, Mr Speaker. Can I join with the Prime Minister, the Leader of the National Party, yourself as Speaker? On behalf of Australian Labor, we welcome you here as well.
The member for Griffith.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question's to the Minister for Water Resources. In August, the state's green-lighted a new Inspector-General for the Murray-Darling Basin, and Mick Kilty became Interim Inspector-General. Yesterday, after meeting with irrigators, the NFF's Tony Marr said, "What we've agreed to is to make sure that Mick Kilty has the powers to take action where it's needed." When will we see the legislation?
The Minister for Water Resources has the call.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. We are continuing to work with the states. There are constitutional issues pertaining to the powers in which we wish to give to Mr Kilty, who is the interim inspector as we stand at the moment, and then will be a cabinet appointment. If Mr Kilty applies, his name will come forward. The reality is there is crossover in terms of constitutional powers that we are asking for Mr Kilty to have. So until I can get that agreement from the states, it is difficult for us to prepare the legislation and to bring to this parliament to finalise. We have been engaging with the states, as has the Inspector-General, to ensure that they have comfort around that, and that's around some of the powers we wish to give him, around being able to compel evidence and actually be able to refer to integrity commissions. So we are working with the states as quickly as we can, but in the interim, to be able to continue on we are asking the states to act with cooperation. And they are, and they have. And I think one of the things we should be proud of, well, I think there's something that we should be proud of, is the fact that there are legislative requirements to the member for Hunter. That's why we work in this place. You here longer than me. So let me just make this clear, that we have come a long way with respect to the Murray-Darling Basin Plan over the last 18 months, and many of us with a bipartisan approach, and I acknowledge the member for Watson. So we will continue to work through that. The only delay is having the states agree. And once that is done, this legislation will be entered into this parliament, and we'd expect a bipartisan approach to the supporting of that, and the states will work through to ensure this further review with Mr Kilty is complied with.
Just before I call on the next question from the independents, I'd also like to inform the House that we have present in the gallery this afternoon the Honourable Martin Pakula, a Minister in the Victorian Government, Minister for Racing, Jobs, Innovation, Trade and Minister for Tourism, Sport and Major Events, and can I say also a passionate and loyal Carlton supporter. Welcome to the House, Martin. And it's the independence question. The member for Kennedy.
The Minister for Health. 1,400 Australians currently waitlisted for transplants. 11,000 Australians on dialysis and needing life-saving kidney transplants. In 2018, with 160,000 deaths, there are only 1,544 transplants. Minister, therefore, should we continue with the opt-in donor system where only 1 in 3 Australians are registered and where 69% of people oppose it, favouring the universal donor register with an opt-out option and or next of kin approval? Can a Christmas present to those at death's door be an all-in opt-out register?
The Leader of the House.
Just if I might assist the member for Kennedy, I understand that organ donation falls inside the responsibilities of the Minister for Regional Services, not the Minister for Health.
Okay. And I therefore call the Minister for Regional Services and thank the Leader of the House. The Minister for Regional Health.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I thank the member for Kennedy for his questions. Obviously, the donation of an organ is one of the most precious gifts someone can leave on their passing. The member does mention a large number of people on wait lists, and sadly, while it is a wonderful thing to do, it is quite complicated. Only 2% of the people who pass away in hospital in Australia are suitable to be able to donate. And so there are a couple of things I might say to the member for Kennedy that need to be done. On government level, we need to make sure that we've got the processes in place so that we can use those organs when we come through. So at the moment, we've got about 250 doctors and nurses trained in transplant around 95 hospitals, and we are growing that. The other one is that people can go and register online, donatelife.gov.au, and I understand the member for Kennedy's reluctance about online access, but probably the member for Kennedy did mention coming up to Christmas. I think the most valuable thing we can do is talk to our family and friends, because despite whether it's opt-in or opt-out, and in other countries around the world where we have had the opt-out system, it hasn't changed a lot. The main reason people are able to donate their organs is because they've had a conversation with their family. So over Christmas, I would encourage everyone in this House, anyone listening, to have that conversation with your family to make your wishes clear. I have personally experienced, member for Kennedy, a young lad from my hometown tragically found himself in a Sydney hospital on life support after a vehicle accident. His death saved the lives of 7 other people. It is clearly a wonderful gift. The best thing we can do is to talk to our family and friends, go online, donatelife.gov.au, and make sure that you give the gift that can make life for others. Thank you, Mr Speaker.
The member for Moore.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Treasurer. Given the international headwinds and other challenges our economy is facing, will the Treasurer remind the House why stable and certain economic management is crucial to our economic resilience? And is the Treasurer aware of any alternative policies that could jeopardise our economic growth?
The Treasurer has the call.
Thank you, Mr.
Just
Speaker.
before the Treasurer warns, I just want to be more efficient. I'll just warn the member for Rankin now, okay? The Treasurer has the call.
He can't get a question, so he's left to shouting out. There we go. Mr. Speaker, I thank the member for his question and acknowledge his experience in business prior to coming to this place, and also the fact that in his electorate of more than 70,000 taxpayers will get a tax cut as a result of legislation that we on this side of the House have supported, Mr. Speaker. And more than 10,000 small businesses are able to access the instant asset write-off that, again, we announced in this year's budget. Now, Mr. Speaker, the Australian economy, like many economies around the world, is facing significant domestic and international economic headwinds. When it comes to the trade tensions between the United States and China, the IMF have said that if they're not resolved by next year, you could see some $700 billion wiped off global GDP. Now, Mr. Speaker, in the national accounts today, we saw the impact of the drought. 5.9% farm GDP down through the year, Mr. Speaker. And we know that the drought is affecting 2/3 of Queensland and around 95% of New South Wales. But despite that, Mr. Speaker, despite those economic headwinds, the Australian economy showed remarkable resilience and continues to grow, Mr. Speaker. In fact, growth has been increased to 1.7% through the year and 0.4% through the quarter, Mr. Speaker. We've seen increases in public final demand. We've seen net exports contribute to GDP, Mr. Speaker, and we continue to see the government, with its $100 billion 10-year infrastructure pipeline, create more jobs across the economy. Now, Mr. Speaker, over the last, in the first time in more than 40 years, we've seen a current account surplus, now a record current account surplus of $7.9 billion. It's a result, in part, of the free trade agreements that this side of the House have supported, Mr. Speaker. We've also seen, for the first time in 30 years, welfare dependency down to a low, Mr. Speaker, such as it is. And we've seen the biggest tax cuts in more than 20 years, Mr. Speaker. And as the Prime Minister has said, household disposable income has had its fastest increase in a decade, Mr. Speaker. And of course, the budget is back in balance for the first time in 11 years, Mr. Speaker, and we're delivering the first surplus in 12 years. Now, Mr. Speaker, could you imagine if those opposite had got their chance in government, they would have been whacking the Australian economy with $387 billion of higher taxes that the member for Rankin said he was pleased about, and higher taxes that Chairman Swan still wants Labor to hold on to, Mr. Speaker. So only this side of the House can be relied on to see the economy continue to grow. Only this side of the economy the side of the House can see us create more jobs, and only this side of the House can continue to lower taxes.
The minister's time has concluded. The Leader of the Opposition.
Thanks, Mr. Speaker. My question is addressed to the Prime Minister, and I refer to the Prime Minister's statement after the release of last quarter's national accounts about the economy, where he said the following, and I quote, "You'd expect that things would improve in the next quarter," end quote. Given economic growth has slowed in the September quarter to 0.4%, down from 0.6% last quarter, how did the Prime Minister get it so wrong?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The September quarter growth figures this year are higher than last year's September quarter growth figures this year, Mr. Speaker. And I'll take it through again. September quarter this year was higher than September quarter last year. The growth in this year's September quarter was higher than the growth in September quarter last year. Now, I know the Leader of the Opposition is not economically literate, Mr. Speaker.
The Prime
I know he
Minister
hasn't had a
will
lot of
resume his
experience.
seat. The Treasurer, the Leader of the Opposition, on a point of order.
Yes, Mr. Speaker. On relevance, the quote was from the Prime Minister at the end of the September quarter, at the end of the last quarter, you'd expect that things
Members
would
on my
improve.
right will cease interjecting. The Leader of the Opposition, of course. Members on my right. No, the Leader of the Opposition can just wait because I can't hear him. It's not his fault. The Treasurer and others will cease interjecting. The Leader of the Opposition, if you could
went
just
to the
repeat
Prime
that
Minister's
thought.
own quote that things would improve in the next quarter. It was 0.6, now it's 0.4. That's not an
The Leader of the
improvement.
Opposition will resume his seat. The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Let me run through the quarterly results for September across the G7 countries. Now, of course, Australia, which is not a member of the G7, but yet our quarterly growth was 0.4. United States was 0.5. Japan was 0.1. That was down from 0.4 in the previous quarter. Germany was 0.1. France was 0.3. United Kingdom was 0.3. Italy was 0.1. Canada was 0.3. For the euro area, it was 0.2. For the OECD, it was 0.3. The Australian economy grew by 0.4, Mr Speaker, and it wasn't just that. It wasn't just that, Mr Speaker. Through the year, growth went from 1.4 to 1.7, Mr Speaker. Our through-the-year growth is higher at the end of the September quarter than it was at the end of the June quarter, Mr Speaker. But importantly, we had a 2.5% growth in household disposable income, Mr Speaker, which is the biggest increase in a quarter we've seen in a decade, and the average compensation per employee, the average wage, Mr Speaker, rose by 0.7 in the quarter to 2.9% higher over the year. Now, Mr Speaker, those opposite like to talk the economy down. Mr Speaker, they like to talk the economy down, but the Australian people have a different view. They wanted to earn more and they wanted to keep more of what they earn. That's what they voted for at the last election, Mr Speaker, because they knew the Labor Party wanted to take more of their hard earnings, Mr Speaker. They wanted to increase taxes. They thought the answer to the challenges in our economy was higher taxes. Now, only an economic genius of a Labor Party pedigree of those opposite, Mr Speaker, could think that increasing taxes at a time of international and domestic strain on our economy was a good idea, but would have to take an absolute economic incompetent like the Leader of the Opposition to think that keeping those higher taxes 6 months later, he's had 6 months to say that was a bad idea. That was a shocking idea. We shouldn't have sought to take money away from retirees. We shouldn't have sought to tax housing. We shouldn't have done any of that, Mr Speaker. He is stuck to those taxes just as much as the previous Leader of the Opposition was.
The member for Stirling.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Home Affairs. Will the Minister outline to the House how the Morrison government is building Australia's border protection resilience through its stable and certain policies? And is the Minister aware of any alternative policies that would put our borders at risk?
The Minister for Home Affairs.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. I thank the member for Stirling. He has real commitment to his questions. Well done. Thank you. Thank you very much. Mr Speaker, I'm very proud of the fact that this government, under the Prime Minister's leadership, we've been working hard for a long period of time to clean up Labor's mess on our borders. When the Prime Minister was the Minister for Immigration and Border Protection, and when I took over from that position, we have a very significant issue, given that people are still wanting to get on boats today. We have a very significant problem because we knew that there had been some 1,200 people who had drowned at sea under Labor. There were 50,000 people who arrived on 800 boats, and there were 8,000 children in detention. And we set about making sure that we could clean up that mess, and we have, to our best ability, Mr Speaker, dealt with Labor's problems, but there is still a way to go. Now, 12 months ago, almost to the day, the Labor Party sided with the Greens to weaken our border protection policies by voting into legislation the Medivac law. It provided no option for the Minister of the day to discriminate against people who would be of bad character. The government was compelled to bring those people to our country, and worse than that, once people had received medical attention, couldn't be sent back to their country of origin or to either Nauru or to PNG. So, Mr Speaker, we have already in place a regime that allowed people that required medical attention off Madison Nauru to receive that medical attention either on Nauru or in PNG through multi-million-dollar investments that we had made to provide support to upgrading of facilities and to provide support to medical staff on the ground. People received that medical attention in either of those two countries or in Taiwan at the International Hospital in Port Moresby, or in some cases, if they weren't able to be dealt with offshore, those people came to our country for medical attention. So in total, about 1,000 people, not just those that were in need of medical attention, but support members from their family groups as well, did come to our country, and we were providing those people with the support that they needed. So it is evidenced, Mr Speaker, through this whole debate that the Medivac law was never about providing support to people who needed medical attention. It was always a backdoor way to get into our country. And today, Mr Speaker, we saw the Labor Party and the Greens yet again unite to try and weaken our border protection policies by opposing our proposal to abolish the Medivac laws, as bad as they were. And the Labor Party, even to this very moment, Mr Speaker, says with a foghorn to the Australian people that they have no capacity to deal with the threats off our coast. They have no ability to keep our borders secure, and the Leader of the Opposition today proved that he's just as bad as any of his predecessors.
The Minister's time has concluded. The member for Rankin has
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Treasurer. Is annual economic growth of 1.7% below average, below budget forecasts, below what it was before the election, below what it was when he became Treasurer, below what it was when the government was first elected, or all of the above?
The Treasurer has the call.
Mr Speaker, economic growth is at 1.7% through the year, and at the budget we had it at 2.75% for 1920, and we will make updates to our forecasts at my EFO, Mr Speaker. But the bottom line is the Australian economy continues to grow, and no matter how many times the member for Rankin disregards the advice of the former member for Lilly and goes out there and talks down the Australian economy and puts Australian jobs at risk, the Australian economy is resilient and jobs are being created.
The member for Rankin.
Speaker, the reality is today's national accounts show the remarkable resilience of the Australian economy. While countries like the United Kingdom, Singapore, South Korea, Germany experienced negative growth this year, Mr Speaker, the Australian economy continues to grow. And can you imagine if the Australian economy had been hit by $387 billion of higher taxes at the time that we are facing a punishing drought, which has reduced farm GDP, at a time when we're seeing trade tensions, which has reduced global consumer confidence, Mr Speaker, at a time when we've seen global trade volumes down and capital flows slow, Mr Speaker, and investment decisions defer. The Labor Party had planned to hit retirees, the so-called people from the top end of town in small business, those family businesses, those people who save for their superannuation, those people who want to get ahead by working an extra shift, by working a second job. They were going to hit them with higher taxes. Mr Speaker, the Australian economy has continued to grow on our watch because of our infrastructure spending, because of our tax cuts, and because we put the interests of the Australian people first.
The member for Boothby.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Treasurer. Will the Treasurer update the House on how the Morrison government is providing record spending on essential services because of its stable and certain budgetary management? Is the Treasurer aware of any alternative policies that may undermine the resilience of our economy?
The Treasurer has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I want to congratulate the member for Boothby for withstanding those grubby, disgraceful attacks from GetUp, Mr Speaker, supported by the Labor Party, and attacking her personally, and the fact that she is back in this place is not only a credit to her and all those people who supported her, but it is a credit to the values of the Liberal Party, and it's a credit to the people of Boothby for selecting her, Mr Speaker. And in her electorate, there is more than 70,000 taxpayers who are getting a tax cut as a result of tax policies that we have supported on this side of the House, which those opposite had opposed, Mr Speaker. And more than 20,000 small businesses are going to be able to access the instant asset write-off that we announced in this year's budget. Now, Mr Speaker, as I've said before and I'm saying again, the budget is back in the black and back on track, Mr Speaker, and we've done that without increasing taxes. And when we came to government, we inherited an economy where unemployment was rising, investment was falling, Mr Speaker, and we saw $240 billion of accumulated deficits. But through disciplined, considered policy making, we have got Labor's debt. Now we're going to be starting to pay it back, Mr Speaker, and we've got the budget back in control, Mr Speaker. And we've seen the current account surplus for the first time in more than 40 years come into surplus, Mr Speaker. We've seen welfare dependency at a 30-year low. We've seen the biggest tax cuts in more than 20 years, and we've seen the first balanced budget in 11 years, Mr Speaker, and we'll see the first surplus budget in 12 years. And the ability to have a disciplined economic approach and to get balanced budgets and surplus budgets to pay down Labor's debt also allows the government to spend more on the essential services that people need and deserve, like increasing school and hospital funding by around 60%, Mr Speaker, like fully funding the NDIS to ensure that hundreds of thousands of people will get the support, like the recent package we announced for aged care, Mr Speaker, record funding for aged care, Mr Speaker, and of course the drought support of more than $1 billion additional dollars, Mr Speaker, that we have announced since the election. Now, we know that S&P have said that the Australian economy has a sound outlook. We know that Deloitte have said the momentum is picking up, Mr Speaker, and we know that the Reserve Bank of Australia has said the economy has reached a gentle turning point. With considered, disciplined economic management by this Prime Minister and by members on this side of the House, the Australian people will continue to see more jobs created and lower taxes.
The Deputy Leader of the Opposition has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. I refer to Senator Lambie's statement to the Senate that she cut a deal with the government to repeal the Medevac legislation, a deal Senator Cormann has denied. Has the government finally agreed to resettle people from Manus and Nauru to New Zealand? If not, what is the deal?
Members on my left, the Prime Minister.
I'm not aware of what the member is referring to. I have before me what Senator Lambie's comments were in the Senate on this bill, Mr Speaker, and it makes no mention or reference to that, Mr Speaker. I can assure you that Senator Lambie today is fully aware of the government's policies and is pleased with those policies. And today she has supported the government's policies by supporting the repeal of the Medevac bill, which was supported by the Labor Party a year ago, around about this time, Mr Speaker, and the Labor Party did that because they don't believe in stronger border protection. Mr Speaker, one of the biggest myths that exists out there is that the Labor Party has the same policy as the Liberals and Nationals when it comes to border protection. That is just simply untrue, Mr Speaker. On every test, on every occasion, this Leader of the Opposition, just like the last Leader of the Opposition, has proven themselves to be weak on border protection. And the Australian people know it. They know Labor can't be trusted on border protection because they know they were the architects of the last time and the time before that, Mr Speaker, when we saw these things occur in the way they did, seeking to frustrate the policies of the government on this occasion and on previous occasions when we have sought to remedy the problems that have been faced on our borders. Mr Speaker, Labor are weak on border protection. The Australian people know it, and this Leader of the Labor Party in particular is weak on border protection, and he confirmed that today by his response and his reaction to the repeal of the Medevac bill. Now, our government's policies were supporting people who required medical attention, and they were brought to Australia, Mr Speaker, for that medical attention. It was our government, Mr Speaker, that got every single child off Nauru, Mr Speaker. That was done under my Prime Ministership, Mr Speaker, and we ensured that we delivered that. This mob on this side, Mr Speaker, this Labor Party were the Labor Party that sent children to Manus Island, Mr Speaker. How do I know that? I went there as a shadow immigration minister and I sat with the mothers and children that they sent to Manus Island, Mr Speaker. So I will not take lectures from a Labor
Members
Party
on both
that
sides.
showed themselves to be the most
The member for Isaacs is warned.
outrageous treatment of women and children in sending them to Manus Island, and then did nothing while we sought to stop the deaths at sea, and we got every single child off Manus and off Nauru, Mr Speaker. The Labor Party's record on this issue is beyond disgrace. And if this leader of the Labor Party ever got the opportunity to be in charge of border protection, he would set a new low.
The member for Robertson.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and my question is to the Minister for Education. Will the Minister outline how the Morrison government is building better education standards for Australian schools through its stable and certain budget management?
Just before I call the minister, members on my left, the member for McMahon, the Minister for Education has the call.
Thanks, Mr Speaker, and can I thank the member for Robinson for her question and for her passion for education and for all the students in her electorate. I know she cares deeply about this matter. I know she cares deeply about the $310 billion that we're investing in education, an over 60% increase. Last year we provided $18.7 billion for education. This year, $19.9 billion. Next year, we're providing $21.4 billion, and we're providing $22.9 billion the year after. And we're doing this because of our sound economic management. No new taxes over here, no taxing the economy to death over here. We just want to provide the sound economic management, which means that we can continue to grow our economy and grow funding for education. So what that means for state schools, our growth in funding is increasing by 6.4%. When it comes to the non-government sector, it's 4.9%. We've also signed national school reform agreements with every single state and territory, and bilateral agreements as well, which means that we can adopt the Gonski reforms. Now, it's the Gonski reforms that will transform the standards that we're currently seeing in our schooling system. And as I said yesterday, that is why we need every state and territory on board. Every state and territory on board. We need to be bold. We need to drive these reforms through. And I say to every state and territory education minister, leave the talking points from the unions behind when you come to the meeting next week. We need to implement and we need to be adventurous. And what do we need to do? We have to focus on literacy and numeracy. They are the fundamentals, and that's what we want to do. We want to do that by making sure that every student can map their progression when it comes to literacy and numeracy. But more importantly, we also want to provide an institute that will give our teachers the expertise they need to drive these improvements in literacy and numeracy. Now, these are important reforms. These are the reforms that David Gonski recommended to us, and we have to make sure the states and territories come on board. Now, those opposite seem to think that this was their idea. They had 27 different funding agreements, 27 different funding agreements when they were in office. 27. Guess how many states were signed up to their national school reforms? Guess how many states they had? Three. How many have we got? We've got the lot, and we need to drive reforms next week, and that is what we'll be doing.
The Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Today's report, Liberal MP Lou, linked to donor at centre of cash drop inquiry, reveals the CEO of the company, Bryson, received $1 million in cash from a heroin trafficker, including $500,000 in a backpack, and the company donated $105,000 to the Liberals. The company has been subject to a drug trafficking and money laundering probe by the Federal Police and the Criminal Intelligence Commission. What steps has the Prime Minister taken to investigate links between the Health Minister, the member for Chisholm and this company?
Just before I call the Leader of the House. I'll see what he has to say.
Mr. Speaker,
we might have different problems with the question.
Sure, there are multiple problems with the question, but mine is that it is not inside the Prime Minister's portfolio of responsibilities as broad as they are.
Yeah, the Manager of Opposition Business.
Yes.
Mr. Speaker, the part of the question that you've got the initial information, which has to be there to make sense of the eventual question, and when it gets to the question, it is specifically what steps has the Prime Minister taken. I don't see how what steps the Prime Minister has taken to investigate can be anything other than his responsibility.
Yeah, but the problem is I hear the Manager of Opposition Business, but as I've ruled previously on these matters, and indeed if the Manager of Opposition Business takes his seat, I might be a little while. As I've ruled before, if it doesn't relate to the Prime Minister's responsibilities, the question's not in order. And what I'd say to the Manager of Opposition Business, where questions have anchored the responsibility to a minister or the Prime Minister, that indeed has been their argument to be about why I should allow them. So on that question, I'm going to rule it out of order, and we'll go to the next question. The member for Braddon.
My question is to the Minister for Home Affairs. Will the Minister outline to the House how the Morrison government is building the resilience of Australia's national security and how this helps to protect Australians from the threat of terrorism?
The Minister for Home Affairs has the call.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. I thank the honourable member for his question and for his strong support of the government's policies which help to keep Australians safe. And, Mr Speaker, the Morrison government is absolutely committed to making sure that we can support our agencies at a Commonwealth level, principally the Australian Federal Police, ASIO, AUSTRAC, the ACIC and others within my portfolio, as well as across government. We've done that, Mr Speaker, by providing more funding to help our investigators and our analysts disrupt attacks before they happen, and we've done it so that they can work with their international counterparts to look at what people are saying offshore, what planning and preparation may be going into a terrorist attack in our country or indeed in the country of one of our allies or elsewhere. But, Mr Speaker, over and above that, and very importantly, we've been able to provide now 18 tranches of counter-terrorism legislation since 2014, including the Temporary Exclusion Orders Bill and the Assistance and Access Act, and that, Mr Speaker, has gone directly to providing support to ASIO, to the AFP and to our joint counter-terrorism teams across the country to keep Australians safe. So, Mr Speaker, we are building the resilience of our agencies and of our country to deal with the very significant threat of those that would seek to do us harm. I can advise the House today that earlier on this morning, the Australian Federal Police, along with the Joint Counter-Terrorism Team, has arrested a 21-year-old male following a counter-terrorism investigation. It's alleged in relation to that individual that he was preparing or undertaking acts in preparation for a terrorist act in addition to other offences. And this is one of many investigations, tragically, that is underway, led by the Joint Counter-Terrorism Teams. I praise the New South Wales Police and all of those who are involved in that team that work every hour of the day to keep Australians safe. There is much of their work that will never be discovered or disclosed to the Australian public, but I can assure you, out of the briefings that I receive, we are absolutely supported by the best people in the world. Their training, their expertise is something that all Australians should be very proud of. And as we know, Mr Speaker, in this investigation, as I'm advised by the Commissioner of the Australian Federal Police, the investigators did utilise the new assistance and access legislation, and it was a very important part of the investigative technique in relation to this matter. And I note, Mr Speaker, frankly with sadness, that Senator Keneally in the Senate is trying to introduce a bill to water down that act, which is quite remarkable. It's a political stunt similar to those we've seen her involved in. No wonder the former leader of the Labor Party was trying to dispatch her to foreign shores. But I can tell you, Mr Speaker, the Labor Party will seek to do damage if they get through this bill in the Parliament, and we will oppose it.
The member's time has concluded. The member for Hindmarsh.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Emissions Reduction.
At 12:45 today, the Minister failed to comply with the Senate's order to provide any evidence backing his claim that the fraudulent document he used to attack the Lord Mayor of Sydney was downloaded from the City of Sydney website. Will the Minister provide that evidence now?
But just before I call the Minister, I'm just going to say any questions can be answered, but as a matter of principle, on behalf of all members of the House of Representatives, there is absolutely no obligation to comply with a Senate order. And that's an important principle. Indeed, there have been requests in the past that members of this House appear at Senate hearings, and former Prime Minister Keating responded more colourfully than I am now. And I'm just going to say on behalf of all members of this House, the Senate has no business seeking members of this House to comply with anything they seek to do. So, as you can tell, my attitude to the first part of the question, the member for Solomon, if you want to go and be a senator, go for your life. The member for Hindmarsh, on a point of order.
Thank you for that clarification, Speaker. I wonder whether I could reword the question in accordance with the order. Well, I actually wasn't asking you.
No, I'll just say to those opposite.
Sorry,
if I was
criticism about hair from the
Treasurer. If I was the Treasurer, I wouldn't mention hair at this point in time.
Gobsmacked.
I didn't say. I think let's just change the topic. We'll all be in trouble. I didn't say that the question was out of order. I said it was just important as Speaker on behalf of members of this House. We are no more going to comply with Senate orders or appear at Senate committees. There's no compunction. The last part of the question was in order. The Minister.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. And Mr Speaker, I'll always cooperate on matters of this sort. Now, Mr Speaker, I tabled a statement in this House last week, and it was a statement from the 25th of October, and as I have repeatedly told the House, I reject absolutely the scurrilous allegations from those opposite, Mr Speaker, but they are so transparent. They seek to distract from their woes with gossip and smear, Mr Speaker, because they don't want to talk about falling emissions that have fallen in the last year and are lower than at any time Labor was in government. Any time Labor was in government, Mr Speaker. They don't want to talk about 3 consecutive quarters of electricity price reductions.
The member for Goldstein.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is for the Attorney-General and Minister for Industrial Relations. Will the Attorney outline to the House how the Morrison government's resilient approach to industrial relations is on tackling law-breaking militant unions, particularly in our building and construction sector? And is the Minister aware of any alternative approaches?
Excellent. The Attorney-General has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Goldstein for his question. And of course it is the case that the government today reintroduced the Ensuring Integrity Bill, which seeks to place higher and more reasonable standards on registered organisations. And the reason that we did that, Mr Speaker, is as a government we will not stand by while a small but dangerous group of militant officials continue to break laws which are designed to protect men and women who just want to do their jobs. As a government, we will not stand by and watch the costs of vital infrastructure projects like schools and roads and hospitals increase by up to 30% because of the militant activity of a small group of union officials. And in fact, Mr Speaker, today in this place, the Labor Party tried to delay even debating the reintroduced Ensuring Integrity Bill until July 2022. A 2.5-year delay they sought to achieve before we would even talk about the issue. And if we look at the current rate of offending, that would mean we'd be looking at over 400 more contraventions of industrial laws by the CFMEU alone before, under Labor standards, we even got to talk about the problem. And that is not even counting what will no doubt be the future breaches of criminal offences. 400 more. So how many more workers Do you say it's okay to be labelled scabs or dogs or bullied or threatened or intimidated before we get to deal with this problem? And if I can focus, Mr Speaker, on one very important provision in this bill, and that is what would be section 2263 of the introduced Ensuring Integrity Bill, which would make it an offence and prevent it from happening, that being where a union officer has been disqualified but simply goes on for all intents and purposes as acting as a union official. Now, at the moment, there is nothing that makes that situation unlawful as working as a shadow officer. And some people, I think, would be very, very pleased with not even getting to talk about that type of provision for 2.5 years. The reason being that there have been many people that have come out of jail and have been welcomed back with open arms into the union movement, into the position of officials, into positions working for all intents and purposes as officials. It is a very common occurrence. John Setka, Craig Johnson, they were the two men who organised a run-through by balaclava-wearing union officials which terrorised workers, men and women, including a pregnant woman. Mr Johnson served 9 months in prison, and the Trade Union Support Committee reportedly issued a statement that said, "We will be waiting there at the gates when he comes out." And there is no law presently available to stop that person acting as a shadow official. In fact, July 2022 would be a very convenient date for one Dave Hanna, who's been found guilty of many things, not least of which recently was rape, because that would allow him to serve the bulk of his non-parole period and no debate until July 2022
concluded.
and come out and act as a union official.
The member for Hindmarsh.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question again is to the Minister for Emissions Reduction. Has the Minister and his office provided data logs and metadata to the detectives conducting Strikeforce Garrod to substantiate his claim that he downloaded the document directly from the City of Sydney website? And if not, why not?
The Minister has the call.
Well, Mr Speaker, as I said, I will always cooperate on matters of this sort.
Members on my left.
My office has established an administrative point of contact with the New South Wales Police, and I don't propose to say more while police inquiries are continuing, Mr Speaker. I don't propose to say more while police inquiries are beginning, coming from a referral that came from those opposite.
The member for Canning.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is for the Minister for Defence Industry. Will the Minister outline to the House how the Morrison government's stable and certain budget management is building resilience in our defence industry, including by creating jobs and opportunities for Australian businesses in global markets?
The Minister for Defence Industry.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I would like to thank the member for Canning for his question. I'd also like to thank him for his service in our defence forces to our nation, and also acknowledge his passion for defence industry, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, because of our government's stable and certain approach to economic management, we are able to invest a record $200 billion in our defence capability. And this $200 billion investment is delivering world-class capability for our men and women in uniform. And what that includes is 57 Australian-built vessels for our Navy, 211 Boxer CRVs for our Army, and 72 Joint Strike Fighter jets for our Air Force, Mr Speaker. We are building a resilient defence force, Mr Speaker, and at the same time we're building a resilient defence industry. Mr Speaker, along with our world-class capability, our investment is also delivering Australian jobs and new opportunities for small businesses on the global stage. And last night, Mr Speaker, at the Australian Export Awards, Victorian business Moran Precision Engineering took out the Manufacturing and Advanced Materials Award. Mr Speaker, let me tell you, this is a very, very well-deserved recognition for an Australian business that is a real shining star in our defence industry. Mr Speaker, I did have the pleasure of visiting Moran's facility in Moorabbin not so long ago, and at this facility, Moran manufactured the vertical tails for every F-35 Joint Strike Fighter globally, something that we should be immensely proud of. Mr Speaker, the Morrison government is well on track to deliver the 5,000 jobs and the $2 billion worth of work for Australian businesses in the F-35 program by 2023. It's an enormous achievement. Recently, I also travelled to the US, Mr Speaker, to make the case for greater Australian involvement in the F-35 program for businesses just like Moran. Mr Speaker, our record investment in defence industry, including our defence export strategy, is opening doors for Australian businesses in global markets. And we know that trade creates 1 in 5 Australian jobs at home, so the more we can help those Australian defence industries, the more we can help them open up those opportunities with respect to defence industries overseas, the more jobs we can create. It is a very, very positive story for our defence industry. In the last financial year, our government invested some $8.1 billion in our small to medium-sized defence industries. And, Mr Speaker, there was a 30% increase across the board for small and medium-sized businesses in Australia with respect to government departments. Mr Speaker, that's what our certain budget and stable budget management allows you to do.
The member for Hindmarsh.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question again is to the Minister for Emissions Reduction, and I refer to his previous answers. Public Internet archives of the City of Sydney website show the annual report published on the website contained the correct travel figures on 27 March, 20 April, 19 June and 24 October this year. Does the Minister seriously expect Australians to believe the report with the correct figures was on the website on each of those dates, then inexplicably replaced with a report with incorrect figures, which only his office downloaded, and then the report with the correct figures was put back up again for everyone else to see?
The Leader of the House on a point of order.
Mr Speaker,
members on my left. Member for Barton. The Leader of the House.
Mr Speaker, there is a high standard around questions that can prejudice an investigation, but it was members opposite. It was members opposite.
Leader of the House,
referred this matter.
And members on my I just want the Leader of the House to repeat his point again. Members on my left will not interject. It's particularly disorderly to interject on a point of order where a question is being contested, and I'm expected to rule. I want to hear the Leader of the House. The Leader of the House.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. It was members opposite who referred this matter, and that investigation, which they in effect commenced by their referral, has to be allowed to take its course. And questions
Leader
like
of the
that
House will pause. The member for Sydney will leave under Standing Order 94A. And if the Leader of the House can just rewind about 15 seconds, then I can hear what he had to say.
Questions like that are either out of order because they prejudice the investigation that members
The member for Sydney needs to leave or she'll be named. Looked like you were getting your photograph taken, that's all. No, that's okay. The Leader of the House.
Or they are designed to leave the minister in a situation where he has no choice other than to note that the investigation is underway and he can't provide the response to the question because the response should go to those who are investigating it.
The member for McNamara can leave under 94A. The member for Kennedy might notice I'm ruling on a point of order, so he's welcome to stand there, but he might be there for some time. I'm going to hear from the Manager of Opposition Business.
It's okay.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. Just to the point of order raised by the Leader of the House. In the first instance, the references to the sub judice rule in practice have many precedents that would allow a question of this nature. Secondly, if the Attorney-General did have a view that nothing could be said that proffered a view on the investigation, then a whole lot of what he has said dismissing the investigation would itself have been out of order. If the question simply goes to facts of earlier answers as to whether or not the Minister for Emissions can substantiate what he has claimed to be true, given what's on the public record.
I think both the Leader of the House and the Manager of Opposition Business, and I can understand a practical point the Leader of the House is making with respect to the ability to answer questions. However, under the standing orders and the practice, that doesn't prevent those questions being asked. With respect to the sub judice rule, without me going through all the precedents in practice, which itself can be problematic, I will simply summarise as best I can in saying there is a point at time where sub judice becomes an issue, and I've made sure that I'm across that, and we're not at that point. As to the Leader of the House's second point, even if there was an argument that he's right, that doesn't prevent the question being asked, even if it might be judged by some that it can't necessarily be answered. But the Minister has the call.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. I made a statement on this which I have tabled in the House. Whilst there are ongoing police inquiries as a result of a referral from those opposite, I have nothing more to add.
The member for Reid.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Communications, Cyber Safety and the Arts. Will the Minister outline how the Morrison government is building Australia's resilience to online harm through the work of the e-Safety Commissioner?
And I call the Minister.
Good Minister.
Well, I do thank the member for Reid for her question. As a child psychologist, she certainly understands the importance of helping keep children and adults safe against harm they can face online, the importance of children and adults being resilient. And Australia, Mr Speaker, has been at the forefront of taking action to keep people safe online. As a world first, we established the Children's e-Safety Commissioner in 2015. Since then, its responsibilities have been expanded to become the e-Safety Commissioner. The Prime Minister earlier this year secured a commitment from G20 governments that we expect the internet industry to do more to protect citizens against terrorism and violent extremism online. So, Mr Speaker, the e-Safety Commissioner is promoting online safety with $100 million for initiatives over the next 4 years. There's a national online e-safety hub, esafety.gov.au, and I say to any young person, any parent, any educator who has concerns about online safety, please go to esafety.gov.au. The e-Safety Commissioner is preventing online harms, for example, through developing safety by design principles, which are getting significant traction in the tech sector. And of course, our government acted very rapidly following the atrocious Christchurch attack, where the murder of more than 50 people was live-streamed online. We legislated tough new laws about abhorrent violent material online, and the e-Safety Commissioner has acted to block access to fringe websites which were hosting this appalling video. And, Mr Speaker, the e-Safety Commissioner is protecting Australians with practical tools to deal with cyberbullying material directed at Australian children, to deal with intimate images being shared without consent online, to deal with prohibited and illegal material. The e-Safety Commissioner administers schemes to deal with various kinds of material and has resolved more than 1,500 cyberbullying complaints in the last 4 years, and is sometimes able to get that material down within as little as 30 minutes, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, the internet is a wonderful resource of information, of entertainment, of social connection, but it must be safe for users, and that is why the Morrison government has articulated on behalf of the Australian community our very clear expectations of the internet industry, and we are backing those expectations with the force of law.
Just before I was just going to just point something out. The member for Sydney, as members know, has been excluded for an hour and was just in the gallery. I just remind members that the standing order applies to the chamber and the galleries. And I'm just the Deputy Prime Minister. Again, if he could just let me speak without interruption, even if he seeks to interrupt others. I'm just pointing that out to members, and I'm certainly aware of members who've been named for that. Can I say... was you, was it? Yeah, okay. Well, let me just say, even though the standing order's there, unless I consider it willful, I wouldn't act, but I just thought it timely to warn people. And the Prime Minister was seeking the call.
Be placed on
I thank the Prime Minister.